On today's episode, we've got a K car that weighed less than a motorbike and sounded like one too. A French saloon that had the unenviable job of replacing the most successful model in its maker's history. And a sports car with an engine that had fewer parts than a Swiss watch, but drank more fuel than a luxury barge. Some say these cars prove that 1979 was the year engineering went completely mad. Others claim that putting a two-stroke engine in a car with plastic windows is the automotive equivalent of serving champagne in a paper cup. And some insist that rotary engines are the future, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. All we know is they're the Suzuki Alto, the Peugeot 505, and the Mazda RX7. This is Four Wheels and Fuel, Season 3, Episode 9.
Suzuki Alto. 47万円。
Picture this. It's May 1979 and Suzuki is on the brink. The oil crisis has hammered demand and they need a miracle. What they came up with was the Alto, a three-door commercial van with a two-stroke engine and rear windows made of fiberglass. And it saved the company. The Alto was brilliantly cynical. Suzuki took their Fronte passenger car, lobbed off a door, fitted a folding rear seat, and declared it a commercial vehicle, which meant no catalytic converters, no luxury tax, fewer safety standards. The result? A price of 470,000 yen. It was like buying a bicycle and discovering it came with an engine. You probably don't remember these. They were never common outside Japan. But in 1979, if you lived in Tokyo and needed transport without walking, this was your answer. Tiny, cheap, utterly shameless about what it was. The Alto had a 539 cubic centimetre, two-stroke, three-cylinder engine. Two-stroke, like moped. It produced 28 horsepower and made noises suggesting it was powered by angry bees. But this was a K car, Japan's special category for vehicles small enough and feeble enough to qualify for tax breaks. The Alto exploited every loophole available. The engineering was basic. Coil struts at the front, leaf springs at the back. Four-wheel drum brakes, 10-inch wheels, a 4-speed manual, and a curb weight of about 500 kilograms. Roughly the same as 3 adults and a golden retriever. Inside, it was Spartan. Vinyl seats, no carpets. Rear side windows that weren't windows at all, just opaque fiberglass panels, because glass cost money. If you wanted actual windows in the back, that was optional. Air conditioning? Optional. A radio? Optional. Suzuki had stripped this down to the absolute minimum and then charged extra for anything considered nice. Still, it worked. The Alto was a sensation. Suzuki couldn't build them fast enough. People were offering more than sticker price just to get one. Other manufacturers panicked and rushed out their own cut-price K-vans. Subaru with the family Rex, Daihatsu with the Mira. But the Alto got there first. It outsold the posher Fronte 5-2. It moved Suzuki from nowhere to 7th place in Japanese car production. Underneath all the cynicism, Suzuki had actually tried. They fitted 3-point seatbelts up front when most K cars didn't bother. They used individually fused headlamps, so if one blew, you'd still have the other. Small details, but details that suggested someone gave a damn. The Alto was never exotic, never desirable. It dissolves faster than a digestive biscuit in tea if you mention rust. But in 1979, when the world needed cheap, efficient transport, the Alto delivered. And for a 2-stroke commercial van with fiberglass windows, that's not bad going.
If you think this is where the French perform best, we suggest you test drive the 6-cylinder Peugeot 505.
Following success is harder than achieving it. Peugeot discovered this in May 1979 when they launched the 505 to replace the 504. A car so beloved, so successful, so utterly unbreakable that trying to improve upon it seemed like madness. The 504 had sold over 3 million units. It had conquered Africa. It had become legendary. And now, Peugeot wanted to replace it with something more refined. The 505 arrived on the 16th of May, 1979. Pininfarina styled the exterior, crisp, angular, understated. Paul Brack, fresh from designing for Mercedes and BMW, handled the interior. The result was a saloon that looked expensive, felt expensive, but wasn't trying to shout about it. Slanted headlights, a black plastic grille, clean lines. Very 1979. Mechanically, it was rear-wheel drive, increasingly rare by this point, with a long 2.74-meter wheelbase and genuinely impressive ground clearance. The ride quality was supple, the handling surprisingly sharp, especially on rough surfaces. Which mattered, because while Peugeot hoped to sell the 505 in Europe, they knew it would really have to prove itself in Africa. At launch, the engine range was sensible. A 1.8-litre 4-cylinder for the base models, a 2.0-litre carburetted unit producing 96 brake horsepower for the mid-range. Then the interesting ones. The TI and STI, with a 2.0-litre alloy engine developed jointly with Renault at Douvrin. Single overhead cam, Bosch K-Jetronic fuel injection, 110 brake horsepower. Properly quick. In July 1979, 2 months after launch, the diesel appeared. A 2.3-litre 4-cylinder making 70 brake horsepower and enough torque to pull a house off its foundations. More importantly, it had the kind of longevity that turned taxi drivers into poets. 500,000 kilometers wasn't unusual. Some are still running today. Inside, the 505 was a step up from the 504. Comfortable seats, a modern dashboard with a raised instrument cluster, decent materials. Higher specifications brought power steering, central locking, air conditioning, 5-speed gearboxes, sunroofs. Later, V6 models would add speed-sensitive steering and electronic climate control. Proper executive kit. But the 505 faced an impossible task. It was more refined than the 504, more comfortable, more modern, better equipped. And yet, it never quite matched the 504's reputation. It sold 1.35 million units over 13 years. Respectable, but not legendary. Because in the markets where Peugeot truly mattered, simplicity and toughness mattered more than refinement and modernity. The 505 was a very good car tasked with replacing a great one. It rode beautifully, handled brilliantly, and if you bought the diesel, it would probably outlive you. But sometimes being very good isn't quite enough.
Maybe you missed the opportunity to own one of these extraordinary cars when it was new, but now you have another chance, the Mazda RX7. 0 to 50 in 6.3 seconds. Superb handling because of its front mid-engine design. And two models, starting under $6,400. The car you've been waiting for is waiting for you, the Mazda RX7.
In March 1978, Mazda did something unusual. They built a sports car with an engine that had no pistons, no valves, no camshafts, and no conventional logic whatsoever. The RX7. And somehow, it worked. The rotary engine wasn't new for Mazda. They'd been persisting with Wankel engines since the 1960s, when everyone else had given up. The idea was brilliant in theory. A triangular rotor spinning inside an oval chamber, creating power through rotation rather than reciprocation. Fewer moving parts, smoother operation. Except it leaked, it wore out, it drank fuel. Mazda persisted. By 1978, they'd sorted most of the problems. The 12A twin-rotor engine displaced just 1,146 cubic centimeters, but produced 100 brake horsepower. It weighed almost nothing. It sat behind the front axle, giving perfect 50-50 weight distribution. And it revved to 7,000 without complaint. A buzzer warned you when you approached the red line, not because it was dangerous, but because the engine was so smooth you wouldn't notice. Matasaburo Maeda designed the body, long bonnet, pop-up headlights, a fastback glass hatchback at the rear. It looked like a Lotus Elan that had been given a proper budget. The drag coefficient was 0.36, which was genuinely impressive. Everything suggested speed and lightness, which was accurate because the RX7 weighed under 1,100 kilograms. Inside, there were 4 seats, technically. The rear bench was only useful if you were transporting children or luggage shaped like children. Up front, the cabin was simple, functional, driver-focused. Thin steering wheel, clear dials, nothing unnecessary. The entire car felt designed by someone who actually enjoyed driving. On the road, it was brilliant. The rotary engine delivered power smoothly and quietly. The gearbox, 4-speed or 5-speed manual, was precise. The steering was direct. The handling was sharp without being terrifying. It would reach 120 miles per hour and get to 60 in about 9 seconds, which was quick enough to embarrass cars costing twice as much. Mazda couldn't build them fast enough. Demand was so high that people were paying over sticker price. In 1979, the RX7 entered IMSAC-2 racing and immediately won both the 24 Hours of Daytona and the championship. It tried to qualify for Le Mans and missed by less than a second. For a brand new car, that was remarkable. The rotary engine had its flaws. It drank fuel. It drank oil by design, about a litre every 1,000 miles. It needed careful maintenance. But if you looked after it, the RX7 was one of the best handling, most engaging sports cars you could buy in 1979. Mazda had built something genuinely special with an engine that made no sense, which somehow made perfect sense. So there you have it, 3 cars from May 1979 that couldn't have been more different if they'd tried. A Japanese K-car built to exploit tax loopholes. A French executive saloon tasked with replacing a legend. And a sports car powered by an engine that rotated instead of reciprocating. Did you ever see one of these on the road back in the day? Maybe your dad had a 505 estate, or you remember spotting an RX7 and wondering what that strange buzzing noise was. Perhaps you even knew someone brave enough to import an Alto, though that seems unlikely. If you fancy supporting what we do here at 4 Wheels and Fuel, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Every little bit helps keep the show going. Next time, we'll be looking at what June 1979 had to offer. And trust me, it gets even more interesting.